Rockets and Satellites by Maureen Blaney Fleetner. Weapons of War. To defeat their enemies in World War II, the United States and its allies had to fight on the same side as the Soviet Union. Normally, the United States would not have wanted to be on the same side as the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a harsh leader named Joseph Stalin and operated under a form of government called communism. Under that system, people have little freedom. The government owns all the businesses and all the land. That ideology is very different from what Americans believe. Americans believe in many freedoms. New kinds of weapons had been used in World War II, and the Germans had made some powerful weapons. When the war ended, the Americans and Soviets wanted to learn about Germany's weapons. They were very interested in two of them, the V-1 and V-2 missiles. They learned that the V-1, or Buzz bomb, was the world's first cruise missile. The V-1 was called a buzz bomb because it made a buzzing sound while it flew. A cruise missile is like a flying bomb with wings and an engine. It could guide itself to a target. The V-2 missile also was a new weapon called a ballistic missile. As a ballistic missile, it was powered for a short time by its own engine and then fell because of gravity. It was so powerful that it could send 1 ton of explosives more than 150 miles in 5 minutes. When World War II ended, the United States wanted to help both its allies and its former enemies rebuild. The United States wanted all countries to become free and strong. However, the Soviet Union did not want that. It worried about being attacked. It thought that if Germany and other countries became strong, they might attack it. The Soviet Union's leader, Stalin, decided to force the countries it controlled to accept communism. The people in those countries lost their freedom. Stalin also tried to take over the western part of Berlin, the part that the United States and its allies controlled after the war. Stalin set up a blockade so that no one could get in or out on the roads or by train. Stalin thought this blockade would let him take control of the whole city and bring it under communism. Instead, the Americans and their allies began an airlift to fly food and supplies into West Berlin. Finally, Stalin ended the blockade. It had not worked, and West Berlin stayed free. The United States did not like the blockade, and it did not like how the Soviet Union was spreading communism. The United States and its allies decided to set up a group called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The members of this organization agreed to help each other if the Soviet Union attacked any of them. When World War II ended, the Cold War had started. On one side was the United States, and on the other side was the Soviet Union. They were the two most powerful countries in the world, and now they were enemies. The war was called a Cold War because it was not a time of actual fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, it was a time when fights between the two different beliefs about freedom took place in other parts of the world. It was also a time of propaganda. People in communist countries knew only what their leaders told them. The Soviets told their people that the United States was poor and that the American system did not work. The Soviets held big parades with tanks and weapons to show the world how powerful they were. The Americans used radio programs to let the people in the communist countries know that the free world still remembered them. The radio shows told them that the American way of life was good and that there was hope. Weapons and more weapons. In the United States, scientists learned more about rockets and missiles. They had help from a former German scientist named Wernher von Braun. The Americans made a powerful rocket called Viking. The Soviets were learning too. One missile they built was called the R-5. It could travel up to 750 miles. Each side was busy making weapons or arms. It had become an arms race. Each side wanted to have powerful weapons and more weapons than the other. The Cold War was dividing the world. Countries like the Soviet Union were trying to spread communism throughout the world. The United States had to help other countries stop the communists. While the Cold War did not lead to fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union, it did lead to war in places such as Korea and Vietnam. In those countries, the United States helped those who wanted to be free, and the Soviets helped those who wanted to spread communism. The race into space. In 1952, scientists called on countries to develop satellites, or objects that could orbit or circle Earth. The scientists wanted to use the satellites to get information to make a map of Earth. The United States said it would build a satellite. It began a program called Vanguard. In August 1957, the Soviets surprised the world. They tested a missile called an R-7. The R-7 was the first ballistic missile that could go between continents, a very long distance. It was called an Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, or ICBM. The Soviet missile was powerful enough to send a nuclear bomb all the way to the United States or carry a spacecraft into orbit. A few months later, the Soviet Union surprised the world again and launched the world's first satellite into space. It was called Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was only about the size of a basketball, but at 183 pounds, it weighed much more than the 3.5-pound Vanguard satellite the United States had planned to launch. The space race had begun. The United States had been surprised, but now it was worried. The Soviet Union had achieved a lot of firsts. It had an ICBM and the world's first satellite. People wondered if the Soviet Union was more powerful than the United States. A new age had begun. People started saying that it was the space age. It was not long before the Soviet Union shocked the world again. On November 3, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2. This spacecraft weighed much more than Sputnik 1. It also carried a passenger, a little dog named Laika. The United States had trouble getting its Vanguard satellite to work. It started another satellite program called Explorer, which was a success. The United States launched its first satellite, called Explorer 1. The satellite even had scientific tools on board. Finally, on its fourth try, Vanguard 1 was launched. The United States had caught up to the Soviet Union in the space race. The United States decided to do more and created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, in 1958. NASA would lead the American space exploration programs. The Soviets and Americans continued their work. Missiles became more powerful and could carry more weapons. In the United States, military space programs were secret, but civilian space activities were open for all to see. In the Soviet Union, all space programs were a secret. Only when the Soviets had a success did anyone learn about it. The Soviet Union kept achieving firsts. In 1959, the Soviet Union sent the first spacecraft around the moon. The spacecraft took pictures of the far side of the moon and sent them back to Earth. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets gave the world a very big surprise by sending the first person into space. Yuri Gagarin traveled on a Soviet spacecraft around Earth and back. The Soviets called their space travelers cosmonauts. A month later, Alan Shepard became the first American to journey into space. His spacecraft was called Freedom 7. Americans called their space travelers astronauts. Several months later, astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. The space race changes. The space race continued, but where was the finish line? On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced America's goal in the space race. The goal was to land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. The space race was now a race to the moon. More studies were done and ideas were tested. In the United States, the Project Mercury program studied how humans could live in space. The Project Gemini program found out how two astronauts could work together in one spacecraft. Next came the Project Apollo program. With the Apollo program, the United States studied how to land people on the moon and then bring them safely back to Earth. Finally, the finish line of the space race was near. The United States sent Apollo 11 to the moon. On July 20, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped off the landing craft and onto the surface of the moon. His famous words were, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Soon astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin joined him on the moon's surface. The two men collected moon rocks to bring back to Earth for study. They then returned to the spacecraft Columbia, piloted by Michael Collins, and headed back to Earth. The Americans had won the race by putting a man on the moon before the Soviets. The space race was over, so the Soviets started to work on other space projects. They launched the world's first space station, called Salyut, into orbit. Later, Salyut was replaced by another space station named Mir. The United States made its last trip to the moon in 1972. Then it, too, worked on other space projects. NASA built a reusable space vehicle called the Space Shuttle. It launched a space station called Skylab. Skylab showed Americans that people could live and work in space for months at a time. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, the Cold War ended. The United States now started working with Russia, the country that had been the largest in the Soviet Union, on space projects. The former enemies now worked together. Space lessons. Working on projects for space was different than working on projects here on Earth. Scientists had to learn new ways to do things. They had to make new tools and new materials. Those new products now help people in their everyday lives. Here are just a few examples. Many benefits have come from the space race and today's space projects. Even more benefits could be ahead. Today, the largest international science project in history is taking place in space. The United States is working together with many other countries on the International Space Station. With the International Space Station, there will be many chances for ideas to be tested. People will look for new and better ways to do things. Scientists can watch for changes in the planet we all share. NASA continues its space work for the United States. It sends out spacecraft to explore our solar system. The United States also has plans for more human space exploration. NASA plans to send humans back to the moon someday. It may even send humans to Mars and beyond.